Welcome, everybody, to our final speaker series in our event for the 24-25 academic year. My name is Kenji Yoshino. I'm the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law here at the Law School and the Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest and my dear, dear colleague, Deborah Archer. She holds many roles here at NYU Law, including as Margaret B. Hoppin Professor of Clinical Law, the Associate Dean of Experiential Education and Clinical Programs, Director of the Law School's Clinical and Advocacy Programs, and Faculty Director of the Community Equity Initiative. Since February 2021, Professor Archer has also served as the President of the ACLU, the nation's premier civil liberties and civil rights organization. Professor Archer is a graduate of Smith College and Yale Law School, where I was honored to be her classmate, and the author of the book we'll be discussing today, Dividing Lines: How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality. This is literally the publication date of the book, so it's a particularly wonderful day to be having this conversation, and we're honored that you could fit us into such an important and busy day for the life of the book. I know you have several other events lined up with other even NYU colleagues today.
Yeah, this was such an honor to join you. I'm glad you invited me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And for colleagues on the call, by attending this event, you've automatically been entered into a raffle to win a copy of Dividing Lines. So again, it's an honor to have Professor Archer here for today's conversation on transportation justice. Towards the end of today's program, I will open up for Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of this program. So I want to begin by asking Deborah, if I may. Is it okay if I call you Deborah?
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. So many books have been written about systemic racial inequality in America, but they often focus on other domains such as the criminal justice system, housing, employment, and healthcare. What struck me as so novel and original and brilliant about this book right from the jump is that you're focused on transportation infrastructure, which is, I think, a relatively novel concept, right, to think about in the context of systemic racism. What led you to become interested in this particular topic?
Yeah. Well, one, you talk about all those other areas, housing and criminal legal system and voting. Those are areas that people focus on. But I think transportation is really related to all of that. Transportation is kind of dismissed often as just a means to move people back and forth, but it really is so much more. It determines who enjoys access to the very many opportunities that this country offers, who gets to live with safety and dignity, who gets to feel like they belong in their community and others. Transportation infrastructure is the infrastructure of equitable education, of good health, economic opportunity, of a vibrant democracy. And so I think it is critically important, if you are concerned about all of these other areas, that you also be concerned about transportation infrastructure. I've been doing work to advance civil rights and racial justice for a long time. And I think it's important for us to have real and meaningful conversations about where we are and how we got there. And when we talk about race and space and the inequality that exists there, I don't think we're having rich and robust conversations. We need to really expand our understanding of government-sponsored segregation beyond racial covenants and redlining, because when you move beyond those invisible lines, you see that there are also literal physical lines that run through and around our communities, and they're lines that we may think are natural or necessary or just innocuous, but they're really part of the architecture of racial inequality.
Beautiful. So let's dig in, right? As you say, this is not intuitive, and that's part of the contribution of the book. I'm reminded, forgive me for invoking this incident, but I'm reminded of Senator Ted Cruz mocking poor Secretary Pete Buttigieg a few years ago for highlighting racism in the construction of highways and underpasses. Senator Cruz sarcastically tweeted, quote, "The roads are racist. We must get rid of the roads," close quote. For those who aren't familiar with this subject and who are not trying to deliberately misunderstand it, what are some examples of how transportation infrastructure reinforces racial inequality?
Yeah. So that response that Senator Cruz gave is one that I often get as well. That is, they're just roads. They're, it's just a road is exactly what they say, but it is just a road unless it was your community that has been impacted. So transportation is a bit of a paradox in the United States because we often think of roads and highways, public transportation as symbols of progress and connection. And of course, they really are. But the story that I tell in Dividing Lines is about how these same systems have also been used as tools of exclusion and displacement, particularly in Black communities. And so to take a high level approach, transportation, we know, has always been a tool to enforce white supremacy. And as legal segregation began to crumble during the civil rights movement, from the victories of the 50s and 60s, cities across America then started to turn to infrastructure as a more permanent and more visible way to enforce racial hierarchy. And in many ways, infrastructure replaced Jim Crow because highways were deliberately routed through Black neighborhoods to destroy or divide them, to become walls and physical dividers. We also see it in roads. City planners use things like one-way streets, dead ends, and literal segregation walls in the middle of a street to isolate Black communities. And public transportation. We often think about the Montgomery bus boycott or Rosa Parks refusing to sit in the back of the bus. But public transportation evolved under that cloud of racism and moved from early explicit racial discrimination to more subtle dog whistles. And the result has been transportation deserts in Black and brown communities from disinvestment, but in many white communities by design to keep Black people out. And so I guess Dividing Lines tells the story of how racism evolved and adapted in tools like zoning boards and city planning departments and federal transportation funding.
Thank you. So I want to focus on one particular act, which I was not familiar with, maybe to my discredit, until I read this book. But this is the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which I was starting to learn is the largest public works program in world history, allocating about $25 billion to construct a massive network of interstate highways.
Yeah.
You write that this highway system facilitated the development of white suburbs while also driving, quote, "the physical and economic destruction of Black communities," close quote. How so?
So that's a real stark example, I think, and it goes back to Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure everyone on the call knows was decided in 1954. And Brown proclaimed that separate can never be equal in public transportation. And it was a signal not just of the fall of segregation and inequality in education, but writ large, really a challenge to the segregated way of life, a challenge to Jim Crow. And folks around the country made clear that they would fight with every tool that they had to protect their way of life, to protect segregation. And then that Federal Aid Highway Act was passed in 1956, and it facilitated the creation of the highway system. But rather than embrace the fact that it was being built in the shadow of Brown and embrace that kind of pro-integration opportunity to recommit to our values, our constitutional values. Instead, the highway was co-opted as a tool of segregation and part of that resistance to Brown. And it's seen in many states around the country. The book focuses on examples in Birmingham, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, Indianapolis, Indiana, Miami, Florida, and Nashville, Tennessee. And I'll just go into some detail a little bit more about the Birmingham example. In Birmingham, Alabama, they had something called racial zoning laws. And the racial zoning law said, white folks can live on the right side of the street and Black folks can live on the left side of the street. And that was how they were enforcing segregation. When that was struck down, and after Brown, and they got the funding for the Interstate Highway Act, they used the interstate in Birmingham, I-59 and I-65, to kind of reinforce that segregation that they could no longer use racial zoning laws for. So one of the highways was built on the exact line of the racial zoning law. If you look at the map of the racial zoning boundaries and overlay that with the highway map, it follows the exact same path. And a similar thing happened in Atlanta, where racial zoning laws were struck down and they used I-20 to be that racial boundary. And it's not something that they hid. They were quite open with it. And the mayor of Atlanta had been approached to alter the route of the highway just a bit. And he said he could not do that because he had promised white residents that he would use that highway to be a racial barrier and to protect them from Black migration into formerly white areas.
Thank you. So you also write about racial zoning laws, noting that once such laws were struck down, cities used other tactics to lock in segregation, such as redlining, urban renewal, and public works programs. Could you share a bit about what racial zoning laws were, and then how other tactics were subsequently used to achieve what racial zoning laws no longer could? I think you started to already talk about this, but if you could connect it back and maybe give us another example, that would be wonderful.
And racial zoning laws were not just in the South, right? I gave examples of Birmingham, Alabama, and Atlanta, but really they were around the country, these racial zoning laws. And they worked hand in hand with some of the other tools of segregation. You mentioned redlining as well. And so racial zoning laws were struck down by the Supreme Court at first. States resisted. And so ultimately, it took some years after the Supreme Court struck down racial zoning laws for Birmingham and Atlanta and other places to realize that they had to move in another direction. Similarly, with redlining drew boundaries around communities and kind of said, you can't invest here. We're not going to invest in this community. And those communities began to deteriorate. So connecting it to the redlining that came similar to the racial zoning, in Indianapolis, Interstate 65 and Interstate 70 are two major highways that merge in the heart of Indianapolis. So when you're downtown, and I was able to go visit, meet with residents, the highway really does come at you from all sides. It is confining and it's overwhelming. And the construction of that intersection alone, which is known as the Inner Loop, displaced 8,000 businesses and homes and about 17,000 people. And most of the residents who were forced out were Black, and the displaced businesses were also predominantly Black and immigrant owned. And when you overlay the redlining map with the map of that Interstate 65 and 70 exchange, it only goes through redlined areas. So we deprive those communities of investment based on redlining, and then use that as an excuse to tear them down and have the highway run through them. But as you mentioned, it wasn't just highways that replaced zoning, racial zoning laws and redlining. Like much of the nation's interstate highway system, many roads and street grids were built to serve as physical boundaries to also shield white communities from Black people who wanted to break free of their segregated and neglected communities. And I'll focus on Atlanta, because Atlanta kind of used a belt and suspenders approach. They used the highway, as I mentioned, I-20, but they also use one-way streets. It kind of did things like dead-ending streets, so that rather than being able to travel from a Black community to a white community, they just ended the street altogether. They converted roads to one-way streets that repeatedly led drivers away from white communities. And it's still difficult to get around Atlanta because you have such a hard time because of all the one-way streets, and they turned through streets into cul-de-sacs. Atlanta had called itself during the time a city too busy to hate, but really they were focused so intently as they were planning their community on using all the tools that they could to enforce this segregation. And another interesting piece about Atlanta, they use street names they wanted to spare white people the indignity of being perceived to live on the same street with Black folks, even if they did live on the same street with Black folks. So as streets moved from a white community to a Black community, the names of the street changes. And that's still seen in Atlanta, although they're starting to try to repair that. So they really did use all of the tools that they had, all of the street planning, uh, kind of public works tools that they had to really lock in segregation, not only as lines of demarcation, but to make it really, really difficult to move from a white community to a Black community, from a Black community to a white community.
Your book, Deborah, also explores the topic of transportation deserts, the term for communities where the supply of mass public transportation doesn't meet the demand. What negative impacts do transportation deserts have on the people who live in them? And how do those impacts intersect with race?
Yeah. So the broad consequences of a racially discriminatory public transportation policy shows up in people's daily lives: higher unemployment, fewer educational options, limited healthcare access. Many studies have shown that some of the disparities in health outcomes between white communities and communities of color are about limited access to public transportation to get to healthcare. And these are tangible, everyday realities, especially for Black and Brown communities. And we know public transportation in the US has always been a racial battleground, from segregated buses and now to the transportation deserts. Um, the policies are no longer overtly racist, or at least most of the time not overtly racist, but they're shaped by these dog whistles and coded language that are often wrapped in um, so-called concerns about safety and efficiency. And so you specifically asked about transportation deserts, and those are no accident. They're the result of decades of exclusion. And so we hear the term transportation deserts linked to Black and Brown communities. And those are communities that have been systemically neglected. So we carved them up by highways, and then we did not invest in public transportation to make sure that they were connected to opportunities. And so for the residents of those communities, daily tasks, getting to work, to the store, to the doctor, often require long, unsafe, and really exhausting commutes. But in some predominantly white communities, there are also transportation deserts, and that's by choice, because some of those residents have actively opposed public transit expansion, not because they don't need public transportation, but because they want to keep Black and Brown people out. And so I think, it's a bigger story about power in determining who has access. Um, to provide one example, buses are the least favored of public transportation. And they are also the mode of public transportation most often used by Black and Brown people. And in my research, I learned about the death of a 17-year-old Black woman named Cynthia in Buffalo, New York. And she worked at a fast food restaurant that was in an upscale suburban mall. And to get to the mall from the nearest bus stop, she had to sprint across a 7-lane roadway because the mall barred city buses that were used primarily by Black commuters and prevented them from driving into the parking lot. Other buses, the suburban commuter bus, a tourist bus, all with greater white ridership, were permitted to enter the parking lot. And one day, as she made that dangerous road across the 7 lanes from the bus stop to the mall, she was fatally struck by a truck and crushed. And her story is an extreme version, but it really is an all too common tale about Black people needing access to jobs and opportunities that are located in white communities, but those communities have banded together to manipulate public transportation policies to exclude them. And one more example that I'll share was from Beaver Creek, Ohio, is a more recent example. And Beaver Creek is a suburb that's located about 15 minutes east of Dayton. And people working in a suburban mall there also had to risk their lives to get to work. Or if they wanted to shop in the mall, they had to risk their lives because they could take a bus And the last stop on the bus was still about 2 miles from the mall. And they had to walk the rest of the way in the rain and snow and wind and cold. And about half of that walk was along a 6-lane road with a stretch that included an I-675 overpass. And it wasn't meant for pedestrians, so there was no sidewalk for long stretches on that overpass. There was no shoulder for folks to walk safely because, again, it was just not built for pedestrians. And local folks and community organizers pushed back. They were able to get the federal government to get involved and to ask Beaver Creek to have a bus stop closer to the mall or many bus stops along that route. And Beaver Creek pushed back. They said that they didn't want their community turning into the Dayton Mall, which was the place where Black and brown people shopped. And then with more pressure, they said that they would allow a bus stop only if the Transportation Authority agreed to install state-of-the-art surveillance cameras that provided full coverage and real-time feed to the police department, which was not something that happened in any other bus stop. They also said that they would provide the bus stop if it was fully heated and air conditioned at the bus stop shelter. And at that point, the only fully air conditioned bus stop shelter was in Dubai. And then they also said that they wanted to have a thickened concrete pad in front of the bus stop that was more equivalent to what would be required for an airplane runway than a bus stop. And so they resisted and resisted. And I think these communities don't hide the role that race plays. I talk about a community in Baltimore that was resisting having a commuter rail stop in their community. And at one community meeting, one member said, we don't want people coming from Baltimore to taking the train, breaking into our houses and stealing our televisions and then jumping back on the train, as if the commuter train is the best getaway car, and you're going to be on that train with the television under your arm. But this narrative of excessive Black criminality has snuck into our public transportation system and shaped who has access, where the stops are, where the stops aren't, how we invest. We invest in commuter rails, not in buses. And it also has allowed us to have this overlay of policing onto public transportation. And I talk about that in the book as well, that, in New York City, if you park on the street, don't pay the meter, in some respects, that's theft. But the ticket that you're going to get is $35. You'll pay it at your leisure. But if you jump a turnstile in New York City or don't pay your bus fare, you are going to get hauled off by the police and become a part of our criminal legal system. And I think that that has so much to do with the difference in who is it that's driving in New York City and parking their cars, and who's taking public transportation.
Thank you. I now, Deborah, would love to turn from this very dire and damning, frankly, diagnosis to solutions. So the most obvious one, if you're you or if you're me, is civil rights law. But one of the powerful things that the book underscores is that laws against racial discrimination have been interpreted and applied in ways that have, in your terms, severely constrained, quote unquote, those laws' potential to challenge infrastructure discrimination. Can you help us understand this? How have our traditional civil rights laws failed to adequately address the topics that you discussed?
And I think part of that, it was the design, right? The nefarious genius in using highways and roads and public transportation to cement racial inequality was the belief that the exclusionary impact would both outlast existing laws that had facilitated racial exclusion and were getting struck down, but also skirt possible future laws that would promote integration. And I think those predictions have proven to be largely correct because we see the impact that they've had. And the racialization of transportation infrastructure really does highlight some of the limits of our civil rights laws. They're powerful, the language is beautiful and sweeping, but in this context, they have been of limited assistance. So one is that these laws have primarily been interpreted by courts to apply to discriminatory decisions after they've been made. And in transportation infrastructure, a decision is announced, but it's been explored and studied long before that. And what we need to do is challenge the decision before it gets locked in and the full weight of the government is behind that routing decision. I think it also places the burden of proof on members of impacted communities rather than on government agencies who have access to the information and the resources to either prove the reasons behind their choice or to shift them. And importantly, they're applied against this legal backdrop that focuses on intent and identifying bad actors, but ignores structural and systemic concerns. And although the book talks about some of the ways back in the 50s and 60s and 70s where race was so explicit, that's not really how infrastructure decisions work today. There's not a smoking gun. There is not a single bad actor that we're looking at, and using infrastructure, putting infrastructure decisions through that lens really distorts and takes away the power to challenge these decisions. And then finally, I'll note that our civil rights laws really do give undue deference to public officials while placing really undue burdens on community members who are challenging government actors. And if we look at some of the cases that have been filed in this context, the courts have always found ways to explain away real stark racial disparities and the evidence of intent to harm Black communities. The book explores a civil rights challenge to I-40 in Nashville that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed back in the 60s, where there was an abundance of evidence of intent to hurt a Black community and to save a white community. And in fact, when you look at I-40, there's a big lump, and that lump is there, that detour is there just to take out the Black community. But still, a judge found a way to explain it all away. When I was in law school, we studied Memphis versus Green, which came out of Memphis and involved a road that connected a Black community and a white community. And at the urging of the white community, the Memphis built a wall that prevented cars from coming from the Black community to the white community. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's just a mere inconvenience. They were focused on safety. They wanted to slow down traffic. It only adds 5 minutes to the commute that Black folks have to get to downtown. And it was in Thurgood Marshall's dissent where he explained the real truth behind that. And not only that it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a mark, it was stigma, it was discrimination. But we find too often in these court cases that they can explain away the disparities, they explain away the hurt, they explain away the damage. They can justify really bold-faced statements of discrimination that evidence the intent. And so our laws have really not been helpful in protecting communities. Even after the highways, there were highway revolts where communities finally pushed back against some of the worst practices around highway development. And there were several laws that were passed by Congress, and those laws are still in play today. And they did help to modify some of the worst behaviors. They require some relocation assistance. They protect environmentally safe, kind of vulnerable places. They protect parks and historic sites. But what it didn't do was protect Black and Brown communities. And what those laws didn't do was force us to examine and challenge racial disparities in our infrastructure planning.
You argue that we need, quote, new legal tools, close quote, to overcome the shortcomings of our current system. And in particular, you write, quote, we need a framework for evaluating transportation projects that requires government agencies not only to engage the public and evaluate racial impacts early in their decision-making processes, but to make different decisions when their evaluation shows that Black communities face devastating, disproportionate, and avoidable harms, close quote. So this to me feels like a gesture, right, towards what would replace the kind of green kind of, framework, right? Could you say a little bit more about what you would have in mind and how it would work? Is there a way, I mean, I totally agree with you. Like the justices seem to have this uncanny ability to concoct sort of reasons or rationales, at least, to reason their way out of, a very clear evidence of racism. So what is a framework that would interrupt that and would allow us to actually have real accountability in this domain?
Yeah, I don't know that there's one sweeping solution. I have thoughts and ideas about the pieces of that. And so one, mentioned that I said there should be a shift in how we approach these policies, a real shift in national transportation policy that includes reimagining how we use transportation and infrastructure to serve and support communities of color. We often have communities of color house the infrastructure, they get most of the negative and not enough of the positive. And so whether you call it a community equity focused approach, whether you call it anti-racist design, equitable design, or something else, it's about not looking at our current situation as a neutral baseline. It's about connecting seemingly isolated incidents and projects to common policies, laws, and approaches that keep leading to racially inequitable, discriminatory, oppressive outcomes. It's not enough for us to say that racial equity is a goal, because to unearth and address the racism that's so deeply embedded in our transportation infrastructure and policy, and to address the harm and the isolation that has been compounded over and over again, it really requires that we have accountability built into the system. It also requires meaningful community access to decision making and a framework that explicitly advances community repair, improvement, and preservation. I think NEPA has a equity requirement, a study requirement that kind of helps us get to that point, but it also has some shortcomings. I, in the book, talk about the potential of racial equity impact studies, requiring communities, policymakers that are embarking on highway development and other redevelopment projects to engage in a systematic, comprehensive, holistic review of how racial and ethnic groups are going to be impacted by a project. And adopting a kind of racial equity impact study requirement would allow jurisdictions to think creatively and broadly about the harms impacted communities confront in the face of these redevelopment projects before the redevelopment project happens, and allow us to explore alternatives and a range of interventions and other available options. It also helps that if a community does a racial equity impact study, sees that it is going to disproportionately harm a community of color in multiple ways, and does it anyway, we can use it as a tool in litigation, evidence of intent or understanding of the harm in litigation under some of these civil rights laws that otherwise would be difficult to prove intent or meet the burdens.
Great. How do you think about your argument, including the one that you just made about, racial equity impact statements, that we need a new national framework for transportation infrastructure, quote, centered on racial equity, close quote, at a time when the current administration is actively dismantling anything that smacks of diversity, equity, and inclusion? So asking a little bit for a friend here.
Yeah, asking for a lot of friends.
Yeah. One of President Trump's executive orders, for instance, terminates all, quote, equity-related grants and contracts, close quote.
Yeah.
Can we make any progress on these issues under the current administration, or is this something that can only be achieved at a state or local level?
So, the Trump administration has also initiated a comprehensive review and suspension of certain programs within the bipartisan infrastructure law, particularly those emphasizing diversity, equity, inclusion, those that focus on environmental justice and racial equity. And an executive order in January directed federal agencies to pause disbursements of funds that were meant to kind of repair some of the harm and invest in communities that had been damaged by transportation infrastructure. The federal government isn't going to be a champion, but I don't think that means that we don't push and fight, that we just give up at the federal level. But there are powerful tools at the state and local level that we should turn to. Many states have their own NEPA equivalent. Local governments control a lot of the funding, are the first line in making decisions about transportation infrastructure. But again, the challenge is to be engaged from the very beginning, because that is where the power and the ability to shape transportation projects really lies. I've been working with the community in South Carolina for 4 years now, and they're trying to fight a major roadway that is planned through their community and is going to really destroy and disrupt that community. A community that was founded by formerly enslaved people who then moved on to sharecropping and then made enough money to build this community where their ancestors now live. And they came to me for help almost 6 years after the siting decision had been made. And it was really difficult to kind of turn that train around. And it is still difficult. We're still trying. And so engagement at the state and local level is most powerful, most impactful if it is done early. And so if you know that your community is planning an infrastructure project, to get engaged, use the tools for equity and inclusion that exists at the state and local levels, state civil rights laws that focus on housing as well. So there are state laws that require racial equity impact studies. Seattle requires a racial equity impact study. To use all those tools that we have and not rely on the federal government, not rely on federal laws alone, and not assume that the federal government is going to live up to this intent to help us all build back better that we saw kind of developing, still early developing, but developing in the Biden administration.
So I want to remind our audience members that they can submit questions using the Q&A button. I have a couple more questions, but after those, I will turn to yours. So my penultimate question is what are the good news stories here? Are there any American states or cities that give you hope when it comes to supporting rather than impeding transportation justice? And if so, what are they doing right?
Yeah, I think actually there is so much good news in this, and a lot of things to take hope from. Some of the hope, I think, comes from having spent time with the people who have lived in these communities for decades, but have never given up hope. And they're fighting every day with love and determination and creativity to save their homes. And I had an opportunity to spend time with some organizers in Indianapolis who are pushing and fighting back and really forcing Indianapolis to rebuild differently, to think differently. There's this incredible coalition of people who are giving, volunteering their time, providing resources and skills and their professional knowledge to work alongside community members to make sure that community members have their voices heard and elevated, that they have the tools to speak the language of planners, to have their own plans, to do their own studies, and they're doing it really effectively. In New York and Rochester and Buffalo, we are seeing amazing work being done to push back around construction projects that had been planned to harm communities and now won't. In California, the ACLU of Southern California, my colleagues there are doing some really powerful and amazing work around how to make their streets safer without using the police or inviting criminal justice and criminal legal system frameworks into that process. And there are communities around the country that are have been living for decades in the shadow of a highway overpass who are reclaiming that overpass, using it as folks have done in New Orleans as an art installation and local artists beautifying it. People having community markets on top of the overpass or under the overpass. So really, in every way and using every tool that they have to fight these projects, to transform these projects, or to beautify these projects. But they can't do the work alone because it really will take more than physical removal of these structures to weave communities back together again, to rebuild them, to reinvest in them. But I think this is a part of a conversation that is growing in our communities, and it's growing among folks with power to make change. And so I really am hopeful that we will see a shift, that there won't be 5 or 6 or 7 examples that I can give you about what's going right, but instead we'll be focused on 5 or 6 or 7 examples of what's not going right, because everywhere else we are focused on equity, inclusion, and advancing racial justice.
Wonderful. So my last question, Deborah, is that most of us are not government officials, city planners, or highway engineers, but there are, over 200 people in the room right now who are extremely powerful. What are some of the ways that we as individuals, whether it's students, legal professionals, or civic-minded citizens, can fight for transportation justice? So you've already given us several examples, right? That, I should go to the hearing if I know that there's some planning in the works to make sure we get ahead of it and we don't just wait for it to happen. This overpass example is very striking to me of thinking about artists beautifying the overpass as a sign of kind of resistance. But anything else that you would give us as a kind of parting call to action for the group assembled here?
I would just say in this context, as in most contexts around civil rights, civil liberties, and racial justice, I like to say that we can all be a part of that circle of human concern. Whatever your skills are, wherever you are, you can come to the table and be a part of the solution. You can advocate for people who don't have access to power, resources, and influence in the way that you do. Black and brown communities continue to be seen as the path of least resistance because they lack the political power that wealthier, whiter communities have. And so what you can do, and I know, Kenji, you talk about this and know this more better than others, is to be an ally. There are so many ways and forms in which you can be an ally. And you can be an ally to protect Black and brown communities, marginalized communities, low-income communities that are still staring down the bulldozers, that are still the path of least resistance, that are still deemed to be sacrifice zones, that can take in all the things that we don't want, but we so desperately need. And so I hope that many folks on this call who don't live in communities that are at risk of further destruction or don't need the assistance to be rebuilt will use their resources and power to speak up, to be engaged, and to fight for us to build back better for all of us, to build back in a way that is more equitable, more inclusive, more just.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm now going to turn to your questions. So the first one is, if you'll forgive me, a bit of a mashup of several questions, which
Okay.
predictably center around congestion pricing.
Oh, I don't know so much about congestion pricing, but let's give it a try.
I bet you can do this. Do you see any connection between the historical development of highways and the current fight over congestion pricing in New York City? How might it reinforce racial inequality, for example, by worsening traffic and air quality in minority neighborhoods where drivers are rerouting to avoid the tolls?
Well, I think that there are competing stories there. I am generally in favor of efforts to invest in public transportation because at the end of the day, most Black and brown folks in New York City rely on public transportation and they live in under resourced and underinvested areas. So I live in Manhattan, and so I take for granted that there are 10 subway lines that I can get to with a very short walk. But for many communities, that's not true. They have to walk a long distance and then take a bus. Then that bus takes them to a subway, and then they have to take multiple subways. And so I'm in favor of investing in public transportation in a way that helps and support those communities.
Great.
I also think that there's the narrative that the rerouted traffic will go through Black and brown communities ignores the truth that the current traffic goes through Black and brown communities, that all around New York City, the BQE, the Cross Bronx, it goes through Black and brown communities that they destroyed and isolated when they were first built, and communities that they continue to serve as barriers, physical and psychological, and the pollution and the noise that those highways bring to those communities is already there. So I think it would be really unfortunate if we're focused on stopping congestion pricing because of increased pollution in one area, but not focused on the pollution that's there now in so many of these communities.
Thank you, Deborah. The next question is, can you tell us about the role of deregulation of airlines, passenger railroads, trucking, in the racist results of transportation policies?
Hmm. I don't know. That's another question I haven't thought um, much about the role of deregulation. I wish I could speak to that person who asked the question and hear more about what they have in mind. Um,
Great. So we'll encourage that person to come back into the Q&A if they want to elaborate.
yeah, that would be great.
But in the meantime, what are the disproportionate environmental impacts as a result of transportation policies? For example, communities with proximity to highways, with trucks, mobile sources of air pollution,
Mhm.
resulting in health effects and the
Yeah.
resulting health effects.
So the air pollution is one that we think about often. It is the most obvious when your community has a highway running through it, has a major roadway running through it, and there are cars racing through it each and every day. It of course is going to impact air quality. There are many highways around the country as well that come right up on elementary schools in Black and Brown communities, and that combination of the poor air quality and the young developing lungs of elementary school kids is really heartbreaking. But it is beyond the air pollution and air quality. It's about noise as well. Um, Having these highways race so close to your home, through your community, through your parks, really impacts quality of life in terms of air quality, but also noise. And a lot of these communities are now suffering from flooding. And it's a combination of Black and Brown communities, when we were uh, deep in legalized segregation, were forced to be in kind of areas that were more susceptible to flooding, for example. And then when the roadways are built and highways are built, it exacerbates that problem. There's a community in Shiloh, Alabama right now that is pushing back and fighting because the highway was built in a way that created a bowl. This Black community is now in this bowl surrounded by the highway. And when it rains, that community is flooding, and it brings with it all of the health and environmental challenges of being in a community that is constantly fighting with standing water and the degradation of your house. Um, in Sand Ridge in South Carolina, the community I told you that I was working with, one of the impacts of them building the road is going to be increased flooding in that Black community. And so it is, this is a multi-layered harm. And I think the environmental pieces are so important. And in fact, I think, we were talking about the limits of civil rights tools. In this context, the environmental justice tools are often far more powerful than the civil rights tools. So being able to redress some of the environmental harms as opposed to the outright racial discrimination is sometimes easier.
Here's another one, but I should also interrupt to say there's a lot of love coming through for you in the
Oh,
Q&A,
great.
Deborah. A lot of, I worked with you at LDF. You're my hero. This sounds like an amazing book.
Thank
I
you.
also got asked, for someone who came in late, what is the title of this book and will this presentation be recorded? The book again is Dividing Lines by Deborah Archer, on sale today. So please
Yes,
get your
today. Thank
copy.
you.
So let me also say this is going to be recorded. We record all of our sessions, so stay tuned if you want to go back and listen to the previous parts of this conversation. So the next question is, are there opportunities or examples of how to enlist business and or private dollars around improving these historical injustices?
Yeah, I think Indianapolis is one example. And there's an organization there called Rethink, the Rethink Coalition in Indianapolis. And they are bringing together all the pieces of the community because businesses were impacted, they stand to be impacted, and they can benefit from bringing these communities together. And it's important that we recognize that there are individual community member concerns, there are private business concerns, there are educational concerns, there are government and kind of democracy concerns. So bringing all those folks together has been important. And I did mention that volunteer services by private companies and folks who are in that space have been really helpful in having us engage in a different way. And so there are examples of where corporations and companies have helped to come together with plans about how you can invest in entrepreneurs who have been in the community for decades and fear displacement when there's economic investment and new stores come in. There are people who are focused on how do we invest in the long term in these businesses, and that comes from other, private companies being concerned and wanting to make sure that they're not a part of the problem, but they're being a part of the solution. So private actors are incredibly important. They also are among the people that you and I were speaking about that have power and influence to make things be done better. They can give resources to community organizations that need support and help.
Here's an interesting question. Should governments provide financial reparations or land return to families displaced by past highway construction? For example, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and the Cross Bronx Expressway.
Yeah, it certainly is embedded in there a question about reparations. I spent some time with a community organizer named Paula in Indianapolis, and she said that reparations was something that the community was owed and should be looked at. And I did testify for the California Reparations Commission about what highways had done and how you might try to redress that. So there could be compensation because we used eminent domain, took people's property. Sometimes they got compensation, sometimes they didn't. And when they did get compensation, it was definitely not just, it wasn't adequate to replace the homes that were lost and for them to buy similar new homes. And so that is certainly something to consider, something that is done in Seattle or in Portland that I think is really interesting is that they're looking at folks who were displaced by infrastructure projects, not only the highways, but a hospital that was built, and trying to find ways to bring them back to their community. So not necessarily focusing on people who owned land and were displaced, but all kinds of members of the community who were displaced, because again, renters were displaced, business owners were displaced. And through this project, they're providing no interest home loans, financial assistance with rent, employment opportunities, economic investment opportunities. If you can show that you or your ancestors lived in that community at the time of the infrastructure project, they want to bring people back to the community where they were forcibly removed from, and to help provide the resources. So there's a whole range of things that could be called reparations that can help bring back the community, that can help bring back people, that can help start to rebuild the lost economic core in some of these communities.
I'm going to, again, combine a couple of questions to ask you about sort of coalition politics. So there have been questions that have been asked about transportation deserts or inadequacies with regard to other communities. So rural communities, elderly communities are two of the ones that have been flagged. One question says, can we think together about poor rural working families of any race who are impacted by lack of access, comparing it to Norway, which is an incredibly broad system of public transit where even the most remote villages can use to be connected to other hubs. A similar question says, is there a way to get the AARP involved in thinking about transportation deserts for the elderly? So I'm wondering, we never want to dilute, claims about particular populations, but there's also power in coalition politics. So how do we think about that perennial dilemma in this context?
Yeah, so many groups are harmed by our transportation infrastructure in the way that we approach transportation policy. And I think they have unique stories to tell. And that's, I think it's important for us to tell the individual stories. My book focuses on Black folks because of the distinctive historical relationship between Black people and transportation, the intentionality that drove the discrimination in transportation infrastructure, and the real inequality that persists today. But there are special and specific stories for each of these other communities. People often say we should just tear all the highways down. And I said we can't do that because rural folks need connectivity as well. And in some situations, it is the highway that keeps economic opportunity flowing to people in more rural communities. There is absolutely challenges around the elderly. There's a gendered lens to all of this as well. I think it's important for us to understand and know the dynamics in those individual stories, but then to figure out how we can come together and build it back better for everyone, because there is a common goal here. There's a common desire, common harms. And regionally, it is not just, we can't fix it by just focusing on the Black community or brown community. It's kind of like school desegregation. You can't end school desegregation by focusing on the school district that's 90 or 95% Black. You really do need to have a regional solution. And I do think some of the solutions to inequality, transportation deserts in particular, is regional and has to have collaboration, cooperation, allyship, partnership between folks who are working on these issues within cities and the core of our cities, and those in suburban communities, and then those in more rural areas.
On that allyship point, I'm afraid this is going to have to be our final question, but I think this is a powerful place to end. How can we get people with power and influence to really care about this issue when it's so easy for people to ignore what doesn't hurt them? I used to think we could count on people really wanting the best for others if they were informed of the truth of systemic injustice, but the past few weeks have me wavering in that hope.
That's right. I think the past few weeks has had me even concerned, but in the way that people are fighting back in these months, fighting for the rights of others, because when we fight for them, we fight for ourselves, we fight for who we are, we fight for what we believe in, we fight for this idea of America. And so I hope that people will fight for others, not about ourselves, right? It's so much about living in our privilege and protecting our privilege. And what we really should be doing is using that privilege to fight for more equitably distributed harms and benefits of transportation, fighting for a more just solution for everybody.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That brings us to a close. Thank you so much for writing this brilliant book. And thank you as well for sharing this incredibly special day of publication with us. Congratulations on all you've done.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who joined. Thank you, Kenji, for a lovely conversation and for hosting me.
Terrific. We're adjourned.